Hi, my name is Brianna Blake, and this is my nonfiction project over the Challenger explosion. So before I get started, since most of the people in my grade were not alive, here is just some general information about the Challenger program itself and the plans they had before it exploded. So the Challenger program was where teachers could sign up and go into space before and they could teach their lessons to pretty much all of America in space. Teachers had specific days where they would show her video lessons that she was doing in the space shuttle in zero gravity, which was so cool to everyone at the time and kind of still is. So 10,000 applicants applied, which is teachers all over the U.S., and the person who won was Krista McAuliffe. She was a geography teacher, and it really didn't matter what grade or what subject you were teaching, even if you were male or female. They really didn't specify on how they chose her. It was just that she was the one who was chosen. She then went into a year and a half of training where she was able to still teach her normal classes every day and get paid, and then also be there for her family. She had a daughter and a son and a husband who she still needed to be there for. Right here, that is the team that went up with her of regular astronauts who went through the schooling and training of being an astronaut. And Krista McAuliffe is actually in this picture as well. It's the whole team that went up or was planning to go up. This is the launch 45 seconds into the launch. That's when it started to explode, and I'll explain a little later what exactly happened and what happened and what it caused. This whole program itself gave a lot of hope to citizens that ordinary people can go into space. After this, if it worked out like they'd hoped and planned, they were going to start a program where you could go into space and you could pay to go to space, and they were going to try to figure out a way to bring people to space again. And it was also another thing was to find life on Mars was another hope that they had to do while they were there, but it wasn't their primary reason for going up. It was just to prove that normal people can go into space as well. So a question people may be asking is, it's NASA. They train for this, they prepare for this, they go to school for this. How did it happen? And that's what I'll be getting into for this presentation. But one thing to remember is that they are still human beings. They aren't robots. They still make mistakes, and the technology advancements that they had then were not as advanced that they have now. So that did affect what happened. So if we did this program now, it may be a little more effective than it was then. Some general information about the time period was it happened in the 1980s, 1986 to be exact was the year. The president was Ronald W. Reagan, which played a huge factor actually into this whole launch. Not only because he was the president and NASA works with the government for a good amount, it was also because during the time that he was president, this country was big on faith, and it was a big thing, and it was a very Christian time of the U.S., in the U.S. And so that's why the faith and the hope was so strong and all around the country. We had just won the space race against Russia, which actually ended in 1972, I believe, but it was in the 1970s. The space race with Russia was where we were seeing who could get to the moon faster and who had the better advancements in their technology to do certain things in space. Even though we did win, the primary point of the Challenger was to still prove that we were better. It was a big competition between the U.S. and all the other countries, but mainly Russia, to see who could who could do the most in space, which is why when you hear about the moon landing, that's why we put the flag on the moon, to prove that we were the first ones there. Now here's the day of. So the day was January 28th, 1986. The time of the launch was at 11:38 actually, and everyone around the world was watching. Around the country actually was watching. Schools were gathering in their auditoriums with a TV. Other schools were just in their classrooms with TVs. Everyone was watching this launch, even if they weren't watching it at the time it happened, they were watching a rerun of it. And not only that, it was in Cape Canaveral, Florida, so a lot of schools and people were there who lived in Florida to watch, and people even traveled to go watch this launch. It was a huge thing for the whole country. Krista McAuliffe, her students were there, and so was her family, so it was a big deal. The temperature was actually really cold. It was 40 degrees or less with a 20 to 35 mile per hour wind, which caused it to be even colder. And there was freezing rain all over the space shuttle. So it raised questions to everyone, like, is it safe to launch? Not as many citizens questioned it as technicians of the shuttle, but it was still questioned throughout. This is the rupturing fuel tank right here. This is kind of how it happened. That's the start of it. And again, I will get more into that. But the rupturing fuel tank was the first thing that the human eye could see what was happening. And even before the day of the explosion, the engineers had seen evidence of O-ring failure, even when it was not groundbreaking cold weather. They said that the launch days that they did that weren't as cold, even the O-rings were starting to fail, because they do practice launches that aren't as big, but they do practice launches to see how it'll affect with like dummies in there or even not humans at all, just so that they can do safety precautions. So the O-rings were the technical cause of the explosion. And I say technical cause because there was also a lot of human error causes of this explosion. So right here is the setup of the O-ring, and an O-ring is technically like a plastic circle that I think of it as a hair tie. It's malleable and can stretch, but when it is put into place and it is ready, it hardens, but in it cannot withstand certain temperatures below, I think, 50, because it will freeze and crack and burst, which is essentially what happened here, but they still wanted to do the launch. Here is just a setup of the space shuttle, and this is the rocket and the space shuttle itself. So about 0.678 seconds into the launch, a puff of black smoke that couldn't be seen by the human eye came out, and the technicians saw it, but at this point we couldn't abort the flight. So it happened right here where it says SRB, and it was in this little where the rocket was. And so later on, about 58 seconds in, smoke and a small flame went through the small booster, which is on the other side of this one, which then caused flame to burn through the strut and attach to the solid booster to the external fuel tank, which then swiveled into here where the liquid hydrogen is, even crashing into this end of the space shuttle itself. which then caused the massive explosion. This was about 73 seconds into the launch. But then 3 minutes and 58 seconds into the launch is when it actually happened. The major explosion that sent a big shock throughout the U.S. People think that they can't decide if the crew actually died in the explosion or not, because when the explosion happened, right here was the crew cabin, and it actually can detach from the rocket itself. So when the explosion happened, the crew actually left the area of explosion. It was exploded off the side of the shuttle, and it fell into the Atlantic Ocean at about 200 miles per hour, I think. And they can't tell if the crash into the water or the explosion itself killed them, but they do have records of what they said during the explosion, and the recordings inside the crew cabin, which then caused them to believe that not all of them died in the explosion, because they then used the oxygen that they had in there to try to save themselves before crashing into the ocean. So yeah. So those were the technical causes of what exactly happened on the day of the explosion. But leading up to the explosion wasn't 100% perfect either. They had many reasons to take away this launch or even postpone it. At this point, they had already postponed the launch by a few weeks, I believe, and so they believed that it had to happen now. The whole U.S. was waiting for it. They needed to prove to Russia that they were better, and so they signed off on it. Right here, as you can see, is a newspaper ad. It was the chain of command and how they actually worked, and how it didn't have to go through so many people not a lot of people had to approve of it before it could be launched. It was only like 1 to 3 people who really had to approve it, and they had the final say. Right here is a letter actually from the book that I was reading for my research, and it's a letter that was signed off with all of the problems that they saw during the original launches, and they still signed off on it. The head of the department still said, you know what, we have to do this. We're going to do it on this day or else it's not happening. So after the launch and after the explosion, when people found out about this, it was a big deal because they didn't trust NASA as much as they did before. A lot of people were hurt that they felt lied to, and a lot of people's dreams were crushed, and they felt like it was over. So this is after they actually redesigned the O-ring to make sure that this didn't happen again. And there was actually a lawsuit against the company, and it was called the Roger Boyostoli. He was the one who did it because he actually went to everyone saying there's something wrong. We should not be doing it on this day. We need to figure it out beforehand. And they didn't listen. They said no. And so he actually ended up suing in turn of the people. They also held press conferences. The Ronald W. Reagan, he actually had a address to the United States planned before the explosion, and after the explosion he ended up dedicating it to all of the crew, and even Kristen McAuliffe especially, in this address. Here, this is actually the night before the launch. In this circle right here, there is smoke coming off of the space shuttle and the rocket behind it that also told them that it could possibly fail. And but they then again still ignored it. So that's really all that happened and what caused it and what happened after. And so here are just some fun facts. Actually, this past January was the 34th anniversary. Kristen McAuliffe actually may be on the silver dollar coming up next year in honor of the 35th anniversary. There's a bill still trying to be passed, but to honor her. The goal of the Challenger actually has surfaced again. Of Mars and putting normal people into space, but it's not surfacing as much because of what happened. The reason it is surfacing again is because NASA is starting a Space Force, which is now going to be a part of the military. So, thank you.